The small village of Rue Voltaire sat nestled at the edge of a sleepy French countryside, far removed from the bustling streets of Paris, a place where time seemed to have forgotten its way, where even the whispers of the wind seemed muted, hesitant, as if it too wished not to disturb the tranquility. Here, amidst narrow cobbled streets and ivy-clad buildings, there stood an old clockmaker's shop, Le Temps Retrouvé, placed so precisely out of place in the world of modernity that it seemed almost suspended in time itself. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of polished wood, oil, and aged brass. The clockmaker, Monsieur Lucien Delacroix, had spent nearly 4 decades of his life perfecting the art of making timepieces. Every tick of his creations echoed in the quiet shop, as steady and predictable as the hands of his meticulously crafted clocks. In the far corner of the room, a grandfather clock stood tall, its polished wood gleaming under the soft glow of an oil lamp. A faint ticking reverberated through the room, and for the briefest moment it seemed as though time itself had paused. It was in this setting that we meet Captain Arthur Hastings, retired from the British Army and seeking perhaps an escape from the noise of the world. He had been invited to visit his old friend Hercule Poirot for a brief respite from his own tangled thoughts. Their friendship had been tested over many years, and though their lives had often parted on different paths, they were bound together by a shared history of solving mysteries. Hastings had arrived in Rue Voltaire earlier that day, settling into a quiet inn near the heart of the village. He had heard of Delacroix's fame not just for his extraordinary clocks but for his personality, which was as enigmatic as the timepieces he crafted. Many had called the man a genius, others had called him reclusive, some even strange, but none could deny the fact that Delacroix had a singular obsession with time. And so it was that Hastings, seeking a respite from the bustle of London, found himself walking through Rue Voltaire, drawn inexplicably to the clockmaker's shop. The clockmaker's door creaked as Hastings stepped inside, greeted by a familiar scent of polished brass. Who had entered quietly, now crouched beside the body, his eyes scanning every detail with a sharpness that almost seemed supernatural. He leaned in closer, his nose just inches from Delacroix's pale face, inspecting with the careful precision of a jeweler examining a diamond. Poirot's brow furrowed in concentration, the only indication that his mind was already racing through countless possibilities. The only sound that filled the air was the harmonious ticking of clocks, each one competing with the other in perfect unison. Delacroix, a man of slight build with a sharp beaky nose and silvery gray hair, sat at his workbench, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose as he delicately worked on a clock's inner workings. He looked up briefly, his eyes narrowing with curiosity, then smiled warmly at the sight of Hastings. "Sir, my old friend, you have come to visit," Delacroix said, his voice low and deliberate, each word measured as though carefully chosen. "How fortunate for me, for the hands of time are as ever pushing forward. I was just about to finish a project I have been working on for months." Hastings smiled, though his mind was far from the ticking clocks surrounding him. "I thought I might pay you a visit while I am in the area. Poirot is, as you know, not the only one who enjoys a bit of solitude now and then." Delacroix chuckled, his thin lips curling slightly. "Ah, solitude, a luxury many would kill for. But the mind, Captain Hastings, the mind can be a treacherous thing when left to wander in the quiet. Tell me, do you believe that time itself is the enemy?" Hastings frowned slightly, uncertain where the conversation was leading. "I suppose, time is as much a friend as an enemy. We all must learn to live with it in our own way." Delacroix stood up and motioned for Hastings to follow him as he walked toward a shelf that held a collection of unusual, delicate timepieces, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, others so intricate that they looked more like puzzles than clocks. He paused in front of a strange-looking device, an old-fashioned pocket watch with a golden case that gleamed like a jewel. "This one," Delacroix said, lifting the watch from its resting place, "was made many years ago, but I never finished it. I could never get the mechanism quite right. Time, it seems, has a way of slipping through one's fingers." Hastings was about to ask another question when the door to the shop opened abruptly, cutting him off. A young woman stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was dressed in simple but fashionable clothing, her face pale with concern. "Monsieur Delacroix," she exclaimed, her voice high-pitched and breathless, "you must come quickly. Something terrible has happened." Delacroix looked at the woman with a raised eyebrow. "What is it, mademoiselle? What troubles you?" "It is Monsieur Delacroix's workshop. Something has happened there. It's terrible," she stammered, wringing her hands. Without another word, Delacroix grabbed his coat and gestured for Hastings to follow. They exited the shop and hurried down the narrow streets of Rue Voltaire toward Delacroix's private workshop, hidden behind a tall iron gate at the end of the alley. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. The usually quiet workshop was filled with anxious voices, and a crowd had already gathered outside. Delacroix pushed his way through the throng of people, his eyes searching the scene with a steely intensity. Inside, the workshop was in disarray. The ticking of clocks seemed louder here, filling the space with an eerie hum. It was then that Hastings noticed something, a figure, slumped over one of the workbenches. The unmistakable figure of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix. Not merely asleep, it was lifeless, a strange, twisted look, frozen on his face. Poirot, standing in the doorway with his trademark confidence, surveyed the scene with his usual composed demeanor. His eyes met Hastings for a moment before shifting to Delacroix. "Body, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice calm and steady. "It seems our quiet retreat has come to a rather abrupt end. The game, as they say, is afoot." Hastings stared down at the lifeless body of the clockmaker, his mind racing with questions. Who could have done this? What had happened here in this workshop of time? And why had Delacroix been so obsessed with the concept of time, especially now that it seemed to have run out for him? One thing was clear: Poirot's little grey cells would need to work overtime to unravel the mysteries that lay hidden within this quiet village, and the secrets locked within the walls of La Tang Retrouve. Chapter 2. The crime. The air in the workshop was thick with tension, each breath a struggle against the suffocating weight of something sinister. The lifeless body of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix lay sprawled across the workbench, his eyes wide open, staring vacantly at the ceiling as though trying to comprehend the very last moments of his life. A scattering of fine brass gears, twisted pieces of clockwork, and unfinished projects were strewn about the room, a jarring contrast to the usual meticulous order that defined the clockmaker's life. Hastings, standing by the door, couldn't suppress a feeling of unease. Despite the cold clarity of the situation, something about the scene was unsettling. This wasn't the sudden fall of a man who had simply collapsed from an accident or a stroke. The very arrangement of Delacroix's body, his arm bent unnaturally over a half-finished clock, spoke of something more deliberate, more cruel. I see, Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "The details, Hastings, the details are always where the truth lies hidden." Poirot, Hastings began, his voice steady despite the shock of the scene. "What do you make of this? It doesn't look like an accident." Poirot's eyes flicked up from the body, meeting Hastings' gaze with a piercing, almost pitying look. "Mon ami, no great mystery is ever solved without first understanding the simplest of facts. What we have here is not a heart attack nor a stroke, nor is it an unfortunate fall. No, Hastings, this is murder. And murder, as you well know, leaves a trail, but only those with sharp eyes can follow it." The police had arrived shortly after Poirot and Hastings, a small group of local officers who looked ill-equipped for the gravity of the situation. The officer in charge, Inspector Leclerc, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward as Poirot continued his inspection. "Mon Dieu," Leclerc muttered, crossing himself as he looked at Delacroix's body. "What has happened here? Who would do such a thing?" Poirot stood up and straightened his waistcoat with a meticulousness that was characteristic of his nature. He gestured for Hastings to come closer. "Look, my friend, there is something curious about the manner in which he was found." Poirot pointed to the workbench where a small, finely crafted watch lay next to Delacroix's hand. It was an intricate timepiece, one that seemed out of place in the chaos of the room. "This, Hastings, is a clue. The watch. It is far too precious to be left carelessly, as it has been." Hastings took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the watch. It was small, delicate, with a gleaming silver case that shone under the dim light of the workshop. There was no visible engraving or brand on the watch, but something about it felt important. Poirot continued, "I also noticed something else. There, beneath Monsieur Delacroix's fingers, is a tiny scrap of paper. It appears to have been crushed in his grasp, perhaps in the final moments of his life." Hastings carefully pried the paper from the lifeless fingers, unfolding it gently. The writing was faint, as though written in haste, and barely legible. But there was one word that stood out clearly: Rue Voltaire. "Curious," Hastings muttered. "Rue Voltaire. Why would Delacroix be writing that, of all things?" Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It seems there is more to this case than a simple crime of passion. Rue Voltaire is the name of the street on which we stand, but the note suggests a deeper connection. Why would Delacroix write it, unless he was trying to tell us something, even in his final moments?" Poirot's gaze turned back to the room, his mind worry as he processed the evidence. He surveyed the scattered clocks, each one a tiny masterpiece in itself. His eyes flicked to the nearby grandfather clock, where the ticking seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the room. "There is something about this workshop," Hastings, Poirot mused, as though speaking more to himself than his companion. "It is as though time itself is mocking us. But time, as I have always said, has a way of betraying the guilty. It is only a matter of following the clues." Just then, a sudden voice broke the silence, a woman's voice, high-pitched and trembling. Inspector Leclerc." The voice belonged to Madame Margot, the owner of the nearby café and a frequent visitor to Delacroix's shop. She stepped inside, her face pale with shock. I don't know what to say, but I heard someone was killed." "Is it true? Is it Monsieur Delacroix?" Leclerc nodded grimly. "It is true, madame. A tragedy indeed." Madame Margot looked toward the body of Delacroix and clutched her chest in distress. But who could have done such a thing? He was a good man. He never hurt anyone, and I know he had been working on something, a new timepiece. He mentioned it to me just last week." Poirot turned to her, his gaze soft but commanding. "Madame Margot, you say he was working on a new timepiece?" "Yes. she replied quickly. He said it was his most important project yet. He was quite excited about it. He wouldn't tell me what it was, but I know he was determined to finish it. He was often in here late at night, working alone. Sometimes I would hear him muttering to himself, as if he was solving some great puzzle. Poirot raised an eyebrow. A puzzle, you say? Interesting. But tell me, Madame, did Monsieur Delacroix have any enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm? Madame Margot hesitated for a moment, as though searching for the right words. I don't know. He was a solitary man, kept mostly to himself. But there was talk whispers really that he had a falling out with someone in Paris. But that was a long time ago, I think. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A falling out, you say? This is something I must hear more of. As Madame Margot's words hung in the air, Poirot's gaze returned to the body of Delacroix, his mind now moving in a dozen different directions. This was no random murder. It was a crime carefully orchestrated, and the key to solving it lay not in the mechanics of the clocks, but in the psychological labyrinth of the victim's life. One thing was clear. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already at work. Chapter 3. The arrival of Poirot. It was late afternoon when Hercule Poirot arrived at the workshop on Rue Voltaire, though the day seemed to linger under a heavy veil of fog that had settled over the village like a secret waiting to be revealed. The street, usually quiet and serene, now felt unnaturally still. The murmurs of the crowd gathered outside Delacroix's workshop had reached Poirot's sharp ears even before his arrival, but it was not the presence of people that interested him. It was the air of uncertainty, the atmosphere of tension. It told him this was no ordinary case. Poirot's appearance was calm, as always. His impeccable suit was neatly pressed, his mustache perfectly groomed, and his step light but purposeful. He approached the gathering crowd with the grace of a man who had dealt with such scenes 100 times before, as if the sight of death was as natural to him as the ticking of a clock. As he walked past the onlookers, he cast only a cursory glance at them, his sharp eyes already sizing up the situation. He observed a few familiar faces, local constables and shopkeepers, but none appeared to hold any real knowledge of what had transpired inside the clockmaker's workshop. Hastings, having arrived earlier, was already standing by the door, waiting for Poirot with a look of mild concern on his face. Seeing his old friend approach, Hastings stepped forward. Poirot, Hastings greeted, his voice low, almost as though speaking in reverence to the gravity of the situation. It's worse than I thought. The man is dead, murdered. Poirot didn't answer at once. Instead, he surveyed the scene, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in every detail of the surroundings. The villagers had gathered around in hushed conversation, some speculating, others whispering rumors they had likely heard from the first person who had found the body. Poirot's gaze briefly met that of Inspector Leclerc, who had been standing off to one side, trying to maintain order. Poirot inclined his head slightly, his eyes flicking over the various figures with the analytical precision that had earned him such a reputation. Without saying a word, he made his way past Hastings and entered the workshop, moving with deliberate calm as though he were not walking into a scene of death, but merely stepping into a room to examine a well-organized collection of clocks. Inside, the room was in chaos. The tables were cluttered with pieces of clockwork, gears and springs. A jumble of unfinished projects lay on every surface, but in the center of the room there was no mistaking the grim focal point of the body, sprawled awkwardly across the workbench, his face frozen in a state of distress. Poirot did not flinch. He merely surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail. The body itself told little, save for the position of the arms and the peculiar expression on Delacroix's face. His hand was still clutching the scrap of paper, which Poirot's trained eye had already noted, though the significance had yet to be revealed. Ah, Hastings, mon ami, Poirot said, turning back to his companion, his voice filled with the usual confidence. We are dealing with a case most curious. I feel it in the very air. The signs are all around us, but it is a matter of connecting the dots, is it not? Hastings, still somewhat unsettled by the sight of the body, nodded. What do you make of it? No one saw anything. The locals are all saying it must have been a robbery gone wrong, but Poirot raised a hand, cutting him off with a quiet gesture. A robbery, Hastings. Nan, that is the first thing they would think, n'est-ce pas? But the evidence does not support such a theory. I shall tell you this, there is no simple explanation for the death of Monsieur Delacroix. His life, like his clocks, was carefully balanced. Each tick and tock part of a larger mechanism, but the balance has been disrupted. Poirot turned to one of the constables who had been standing at the far side of the room. What of the other people? My friend, has anyone been in the workshop recently? Or has the scene been disturbed? The constable shifted uneasily, nervous under Poirot's intense gaze. No one else has been inside, sir, except for Madame Margot, the cafe owner. She came in earlier this morning, just after opening hours, but we've asked her to stay outside for the moment. Poirot's eyes flicked to the door where Madame Margot had been standing earlier, wringing her hands in concern. He nodded slowly, his mind already working. Good, Poirot said softly, his voice cool and authoritative. Then let us begin. with the most important question: who would want to kill Monsieur Delacroix, who stands to gain from his death? He turned to inspect the clocks on the workbenches, each one seemingly identical to the next in their function. But Poirot knew better than to be taken in by appearances. He understood that a murder was like a clock, a seemingly simple mechanism, with hidden complexities. In each case, the murderer had their reasons, their motives, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and lies. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to the body once again. There was something about the way Delacroix had fallen, the odd twist of his arm, that struck him as peculiar. His hand, still clutching the tiny scrap of paper, seemed almost too deliberate, as though Delacroix had wanted to communicate something in his final moments. Poirot's fingers twitched, itching to examine it once more, but for now, he would leave it undisturbed. "I suspect," Poirot began, his voice quiet but firm, "that our killer is someone who has been hiding in plain sight, a person with secrets they wish to remain hidden instead." Poirot looked over the room, considering the possible suspects. He turned back to the group of villagers who had gathered outside, some of them still talking in hushed tones, but whose actions have betrayed them. "It is always the case, Hastings, always. It is a matter of psychology." Hastings nodded, following Poirot's every word. He had seen his friend solve impossible cases before, but this one seemed different. The air was thick with the promise of something dangerous and hidden. He could feel it, a sense that this case would not be like the others. Poirot stepped toward the back of the room, where an old grandfather clock stood, its large face staring blankly at the rest of the room. It seemed almost out of place among the chaos, its tick-tock eerily loud in the silence of the room. "Time," Poirot murmured, his fingers gently brushing against the clock's polished surface. Time is the one thing Monsieur Delacroix understood better than anyone. It is his obsession, his life's work, but it has now betrayed him. Hastings looked puzzled. "You think the clock, .. Poirot turned to him, his face lighting up with the glimmer of realization. "Exactly, mon ami. The clocks. Every detail matters. Every second. We will find our answers in the smallest moments. The truth, I believe, lies in the hands of time itself." Poirot straightened, his eyes scanning the room once more, his mind already calculating the next steps in his investigation. "Let us begin with a thorough questioning of those who are closest to Monsieur Delacroix. Everyone has something to hide, and it is only through revealing their secrets that we will uncover the truth." As Poirot stood, his back straight, and his demeanor poised, Hastings could feel the weight of the coming investigation. It was clear now that the death of Lucien Delacroix was no ordinary murder. It was a puzzle, a series of carefully constructed clues that would only reveal themselves to someone with the precision and the intellect of Hercule Poirot. The game was afoot, and Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, piecing together the mysteries of Rue Voltaire, one tick at a time. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The fog still clung to the streets of Rue Voltaire, refusing to lift as the investigation deepened. The atmosphere in the workshop remained thick, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the mystery that now filled the air. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his eyes narrowed with concentration, as though he could hear the very whisper of Delacroix's final thoughts echoing in the ticking of the clocks. The body had been removed for examination, but the room remained, laden with clues and questions. Hastings had stepped outside for a moment to gather his thoughts, his mind grappling with the pieces of the puzzle that Poirot had so effortlessly observed. Now, as he re-entered the workshop, Poirot was already deep in conversation with Inspector Leclerc, who appeared both perplexed and overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot greeted with a knowing smile, his hands clasped behind his back. Come, you are needed. The questions begin now." Hastings stepped forward, glancing around at the scattered pieces of clockwork and the faintest remnants of Delacroix's presence. "What have you learned, Poirot? There's so much that doesn't add up." Poirot's eyes twinkled with the usual gleam of intellectual excitement. "Ah, Hastings, my friend, in every case the truth is never where one expects it to be. But it is always there, hidden in plain sight. One must simply know where to look. And now, we must begin the process of asking questions. But not just any questions. You see, no, we must ask the right questions, the ones that will unlock the hidden truths." Inspector Leclerc, who had been standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Poirot, I trust your methods. But these people," he gestured towards the group of locals gathered outside, some of them still in shock, others whispering to one another. "They're all claiming ignorance. No one saw anything. They all say they don't know what happened." Poirot raised a hand, signaling for Leclerc to calm down. "Patience, mon ami. A puzzle has many pieces, but it is only when the right pieces are put together that it becomes clear. The locals, they are but players in a much larger drama. It is not enough to question them merely for the sake of it. No, we must understand their roles, their motives, their fears. Only then will the truth reveal itself." Turning to the constables, Poirot instructed them to gather the suspects. "We must speak with each of them, one by one. It is only in the silence between words that we will hear the truth." The first to be called in was Madame Margot, the cafe owner. She had been the first to discover the body, and Poirot had already noticed a tremor in her voice earlier. It was time to examine her more closely. Madame Margot entered the room with an air of trepidation. Her hands were folded nervously in front of her, and her face was pale, though not from shock. Rather, it was the look of someone trying desperately to keep a secret. Poirot motioned for her to sit, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her squirm. Madame Margot, you were the one who discovered the body. Yes. You were here before the police. Yes, she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I came in early this morning, as I usually do. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped inside. The door was ajar, and the room was in disarray. I found him there, lying on the workbench. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. And when you found him, what did you do? Did you touch anything? She hesitated, then nodded. I touched the door, but only to open it. I didn't go near him until I saw that he was dead. I didn't know what to do. I ran to the police, as quickly as I could. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Madame, do you know if Monsieur Delacroix had any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him? Her eyes flickered, a brief flash of unease crossing her face. She quickly shook her head. No, Monsieur Poirot. He was a good man. Quiet, yes, but good. He kept to himself mostly. I don't think anyone would want to hurt him. Poirot's expression softened ever so slightly. And yet, Madame, you know that secrets are often hidden beneath the most innocent of faces. You say Monsieur Delacroix was quiet, but tell me, was he ever involved in any conflicts, any disagreements? I understand that he had been working on something important in recent weeks. Did he speak to you about it? Her fingers twitched nervously in her lap. No, Monsieur Poirot. He never told me about his work. He was always so focused. But I did overhear him talking to someone a few days ago. A man. I didn't catch much of it, but I know it was a heated conversation. They were arguing. I remember hearing him say something about running out of time. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Running out of time, he repeated thoughtfully. This is interesting, indeed. You say he was arguing with a man. Do you know who this man was? Madame Margot shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. No, I didn't recognize his voice. I wasn't supposed to be listening. Poirot leaned back, his hands folded in front of him as he absorbed the new information. A man arguing with Monsieur Delacroix as the theme of Time, an important clue. It appears there is much more to Monsieur Delacroix's life than meets the eye. And yet, Madame, you tell me that you do not know this man very well. We shall see. Hastings, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. Poirot, could it be that this man is the key? Could someone from Delacroix's past be involved? Poirot turned to him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ah, Hastings, you are beginning to think like me. Yes, it is possible, but we must proceed with caution. The smallest detail, the smallest word, could reveal everything. We must tread carefully and be mindful of every inconsistency. Madame Margot, still visibly nervous, shifted in her seat. Monsieur Poirot, I do not know anything more. Please believe me. I wish I could help more. Poirot's gaze softened. I believe you, Madame, but remember this: there are no innocent people in a case like this. There are only those who know more than they let on. As Madame Margot left the room, her face still clouded with fear, Poirot turned to the next person on his list, the constables, who had gathered the other individuals with ties to Delacroix. The questioning would continue, each interview revealing new fragments of the puzzle. Each person was a piece of the larger picture, and Poirot would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. But as the questions continued, one thing became increasingly clear. Every answer raised more questions, and the deeper Poirot delved into the mystery of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix, the more he realized that time, it seemed, had betrayed them all. Chapter 5. The red herrings. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time the questioning had begun to show its first cracks. Poirot sat back in a chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, as the pieces of the puzzle slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to take shape. But there was something disconcerting about this case, something that nagged at him, the overwhelming sense that he was being misled by the very people who should have been the most forthcoming. Hastings sat across from him, absent-mindedly turning a small coin over and over in his hand. The hours of questioning had clearly drained him, and Poirot could see that his companion was beginning to feel the weight of the case. But Poirot was not so easily disheartened. To him, the more twisted and convoluted the case, the more it played to his strengths. Each false lead, each red herring, was another opportunity to apply the methodical brilliance that had earned him a reputation as one of the finest detectives in Europe. Mon ami, Poirot said suddenly, his voice soft but intense. Do you know what is most fascinating about this case? It is not the murder itself. It is the webs of lies and deceptions spun by those who think they can escape the truth. Hastings looked up, his eyes tired but still alert. What do you mean, Poirot? Who's lying? Poirot smiled slightly, his lips curling up with the satisfaction of a man who had just caught a glimpse of the solution to a complex problem. Ah, Hastings, you are right to be weary. This case, you see, is full of distractions. There are many false trails. Each of the suspects has something to hide, but none of them is being completely honest. I have already noted the inconsistencies in their stories. A clever murderer always leaves a false trail to mislead an investigator. It is the nature of the game. Hastings sighed, rubbing his eyes. So, what now? We questioned them further. Exactly, Poirot replied, rising from his seat with the fluid grace of a man who was about to begin a new chapter in his investigation, but not in the usual manner. We must turn the heat up a little. We will take each person's story, and we will apply pressure gently, of course, but we will show them that we are not fooled. Poirot walked to the window, gazing out into the foggy streets, his mind turning over the small but significant details that had come to light during the interviews. First, there was Madame Margot, who seemed to have an almost unhealthy interest in Delacroix's private life. The cafe owner was, by all accounts, one of the first to notice something was amiss, but she also seemed to be hiding something. Her hesitation when asked about the argument Delacroix had had, her refusal to name the mysterious man he'd argued with, was telling. Poirot had caught the flash of fear in her eyes, and that, more than anything, made her suspicious. But was she hiding something more than just knowledge of the argument, or was it something else? Then there was the matter of the scrap of paper found clutched in Delacroix's hand. Rue Voltaire. Why had Delacroix written this? The street he had lived on. Yes, but there was a deeper connection here. Had he been trying to tell someone something before he died? The note, so simple, so enigmatic, this was the first of many red herrings. Next there was the matter of the clockmaker's obsession with time. Delacroix had clearly been working on something monumental in the days leading up to his death. What was this project that had consumed him so entirely? And what had he meant by running out of time? These were the questions that burned at Poirot's mind. Hastings, tired of Poirot's musings, leaned forward. I suppose we'll have to start with the obvious suspects, won't we? The ones who were closest to him, the ones who might have had a motive to kill him. Poirot gave a sharp nod. Precisely, Hastings. But we must proceed with caution. The obvious suspects are often the most elusive. You see, each of them holds a piece of the puzzle. Each person has a small piece of knowledge that the others do not. And it is this knowledge, this hidden truth, that we must uncover. Poirot turned to his companion, his expression becoming more serious. There is, however, one thing I wish to confirm before we proceed. The scrap of paper found in Delacroix's hand is very important. It points to a connection, I believe, but what that connection is, I cannot yet say. We must ask the others about it, see if it triggers any reactions. With that, Poirot called for the next person to be brought in, Etienne Laurent, a local jeweler who had been a regular customer of Delacroix's for many years. Laurent was known for his extensive collection of antique timepieces and his occasional dealings with Delacroix in the acquisition of rare parts. If anyone had a reason to be familiar with Delacroix's private affairs, it was Laurent. Etienne Laurent entered the room, his short stature and portly frame making him appear harmless at first glance. He wore a deep blue suit, but there was an air of unease about him that didn't quite fit the cheerful expression on his face. He seemed to be trying a little too hard to be cordial, and Poirot picked up on it immediately. "Ah, Monsieur Laurent, please, sit," Poirot said, his voice warm but measured. Laurent lowered himself into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He smiled nervously, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Monsieur Poirot, I am so terribly sorry to hear about Delacroix. He was a friend, a colleague, of sorts. We shared an interest in clocks, and he would sometimes come to me for parts, for advice." "Tell me, Monsieur Laurent," Poirot began, his voice calm but insistent. "You were friends, as you say. Did Monsieur Delacroix ever mention any problems, anything that seemed out of the ordinary in the days leading up to his death?" Laurent's eyes darted around the room, clearly uncomfortable. "No, nothing of the sort. He was always so focused on his work. We spoke about many things, rare parts, of course, but nothing that would indicate any danger. He was quite absorbed in his craft." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And yet, Monsieur Laurent, you do not seem entirely convinced by your own words. Is there something you are not telling me?" Laurent flinched, his hand trembling slightly. No, Monsieur Poirot, I assure you, there's nothing I'm hiding." Poirot held up a hand, silencing him. "Then you will not mind answering a few questions about the argument Delacroix had?" "The one I am told you overheard." Laurent went pale. "What an argument? I don't know what you mean." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, the intensity of his gaze unwavering. "You see, Monsieur Laurent, I know that you heard it. The conversation between Delacroix and a man, perhaps a man you know well. Someone who may have spoken of ... time running out." Laurent's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing as though he was struggling for words. Finally he stammered, "I want to find out. I did hear something, yes, but it was nothing, really. Just a disagreement about a piece Delacroix had promised to me, nothing more." Poirot smiled faintly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "You see, Monsieur Laurent, I believe you are hiding something, and that something is not insignificant. It is the key to unlocking this mystery. Now, tell me, where were you at the time of Monsieur Delacroix's death?" Laurent's eyes flickered nervously. "I was at my shop. I swear you can ask anyone. Poirot gave him a piercing look. I will, Monsieur Laurent, but rest assured, I will also be watching you very closely. With that, Laurent was dismissed, his unease lingering in the air long after he had left the room. Poirot turned to Hastings, his expression thoughtful. Well, Hastings, it seems we have our first red herring. Monsieur Laurent, though he seems harmless, knows more than he is letting on. But we must press him further. Hastings raised an eyebrow. So Laurent was involved somehow. Poirot smiled enigmatically. Perhaps, but for now, we shall follow the trail of this disagreement. It may lead us to the heart of the mystery. The quiet of the workshop seemed to hum with an ominous rhythm as Poirot and Hastings sat in the dimly lit room, surrounded by ticking clocks. The investigation had taken a significant turn with the discovery of Etienne Laurent's evasive behavior. Poirot, however, was not one to rely solely on people's words. His methods were far more precise, far more subtle. Hastings, still grappling with the web of intrigue surrounding the clockmaker's death, sat on a small wooden chair beside the workbench. He had been observing Poirot's every move for the past few hours, watching as the great detective turned over every stone. No matter how small, no matter how insignificant it might seem, it was clear that Poirot was following an instinct, something beyond the physical evidence, something rooted in a deeper understanding of human nature. It was this gift that made Poirot a master at solving mysteries, and Hastings couldn't help but marvel at the way his friend's mind worked. Poirot, however, was deep in thought. He had been inspecting the clockmaker's workbench for the better part of an hour, his eyes darting from one object to another. He had already picked apart the room's atmosphere, the small details that most people would overlook: how the clock's ticks were slightly out of sync, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of something chemical in the air, the way certain tools had been moved or handled. Mon ami, Poirot said suddenly, breaking the silence, have you noticed anything peculiar about the clocks here? More specifically, the one on the far side of the room. Hastings blinked, not sure whether Poirot was asking a rhetorical question or if there was some hidden meaning behind his words. The one with the gold trim, he asked, gesturing toward a tall, ornate timepiece that stood next to the window. Poirot nodded. Precisely. It is not so much the clock itself that interests me, but rather its condition. You see, this particular clock appears to have been moved recently. Its position is not quite right. Hastings frowned. I don't understand. The clock looks like all the others. Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile. Ah, Hastings, that is because you are not looking with my eyes. The clock is slightly tilted, and yet no one has mentioned this in the reports. It is as if it is out of place, not quite where it should be. Hastings stood up and crossed over to the clock, inspecting it more closely. Poirot was right. The timepiece was positioned slightly askew, as though it had been shifted in haste. The other clocks were lined up meticulously along the wall, but this one seemed ... displaced. Poirot walked over to the clock, his hands delicately touching its surface as though handling a fragile artifact. I believe, Hastings, that this clock holds the key to understanding what happened here. It is a subtle clue, but it is there. Everything has a purpose, even the smallest detail. Poirot carefully opened the clock's glass door, revealing the inner mechanism. There, nestled between the intricate gears and springs, was something unexpected. A small, folded piece of paper, wedged tightly against one of the brass cogs. Hastings stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What's this? He asked, peering over Poirot's shoulder. Poirot carefully removed the paper, unfolding it with the utmost care. The writing on the page was faint, almost indecipherable, but Poirot's sharp eyes were able to make out the words. Find the last piece. It's in the time. The last piece, Hastings repeated, looking at Poirot for some form of clarification. What do you make of this? Poirot's expression hardened, his mind already working through the possibilities. This is no ordinary message, Hastings. Someone has hidden something very important, and the key to finding it lies within the clock itself. But what does it mean, in the time? Hastings asked, confused. Poirot smiled, but there was no mirth in his expression. It means that the answer is tied to the mechanism of time itself, mon ami, and I suspect it is not a coincidence that Monsieur Delacroix's work, his obsession with time, was what ultimately led to his death. Hastings raised an eyebrow. But what exactly was he working on? And what is this last piece he mentions? Poirot paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the message again. That is the question, Hastings. One that we shall answer soon enough. But we must be careful now. We are close, closer than we realize. The timepiece, the argument with Laurent, the strange behavior of Madame Margot, they are all pieces of a much larger puzzle. But I have a feeling that this puzzle will reveal its true form very soon. Poirot turned to the workbench, his fingers brushing over the tools scattered across the surface. Monsieur Delacroix was not just a clockmaker. He was an inventor, of sorts, an artist. His passion for time was not simply to craft clocks, it was to understand the very essence of time itself. Perhaps he stumbled upon something dangerous, something that someone was willing to kill for. Hastings frowned, and this last piece, it could be the key to that something. Poirot's gaze was distant, as though he was already a step ahead of the conversation. "Indeed, Hastings, and I suspect that whatever it is still hidden, perhaps in plain sight, perhaps in something as innocuous as a clock, a piece of clockwork." Poirot walked over to the other clocks on the shelves, carefully examining each one with his usual precision. "It is all connected, every object, every tool, every minute detail. Delacroix's obsession with time, the pieces of clockwork, the unfinished projects, each of them has a meaning, a purpose. But what if one of these clocks held something more than just gears?" Hastings stood beside him, watching as Poirot's mind began to race ahead. "What are you thinking?" Poirot turned to him, his eyes sharp and focused. "I believe that Delacroix was not simply trying to make clocks. He was trying to uncover the nature of time itself. And in doing so, he may have uncovered something he shouldn't have, a truth that someone was willing to kill for." Hastings felt a chill run down his spine. He had no doubt that Poirot was right, but he couldn't help but feel that the pieces of this mystery were far more dangerous than he had first imagined. "There's still so much we don't know," Hastings said quietly. Poirot nodded, his expression grave. "Indeed, but every clue brings us closer, and I am confident that the truth, like time itself, is only waiting to be uncovered. The last piece is out there, Hastings. It isn't the time." Poirot turned back to the clocks, his gaze fixed on the row of timepieces as though he could hear their silent stories. He knew that the answer lay somewhere in the intricate mechanisms of these clocks, and that it was only a matter of time before everything fell into place. But time, as Poirot well knew, was both a friend and an enemy, and in this case, it was running out. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced the next day. The fog had not yet lifted from Rue Voltaire, and the air felt thicker than ever. It was as though the very atmosphere was soaked with mystery, a silent witness to the death of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix. Poirot, ever the methodical thinker, had gathered all of the key players in this drama, the ones who had shown interest in Delacroix's life and work, those whose lives had been touched by the clockmaker's obsession with time. The investigation was far from over, and Poirot knew that the key to solving it lay in understanding not just the facts, but the people themselves. "Mon ami," Poirot said to Hastings as they entered the small room in which the interviews were to take place, "we have made progress, but there is still much to uncover. Every lie, every hidden truth will bring us closer to understanding the nature of this murder." Hastings, who had grown accustomed to Poirot's unshakable confidence, nodded, but we could not shake the unease that had been growing in the pit of his stomach. He had watched his friend work miracles before, unraveling even the most complicated mysteries with his sharp mind and impeccable logic, but this case felt different. The deeper they went, the more the truth seemed to slip further out of reach. As Poirot settled into his chair, a soft tap on the door interrupted his thoughts. The first to be brought in was a man who had been a stranger to most of the village until recently, Gerard Dupont, an enigmatic figure who had only recently moved to Rue Voltaire. Dupont had a reputation as a businessman, though his dealings, it remained largely unclear to the locals. He had made a few trips to Delacroix's workshop, but his relationship with the clockmaker was shrouded in secrecy. As Poirot settled into his chair, a soft tap on the door interrupted his thoughts. The first to be brought in was a man who had been a stranger to most of the village until recently, Gerard Dupont, an enigmatic figure who had only recently moved to Rue Voltaire. Dupont had a reputation as a businessman, though his dealings remained largely unclear to the locals. He had made a few trips to Delacroix's workshop, but his relationship with the clockmaker was shrouded in secrecy. Dupont entered the room with a confident, almost arrogant air. His dark eyes swept over the room before settling on Poirot, as though sizing him up. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, and his appearance was calculated. Everything about him seemed designed to project power and control. Yet there was an unmistakable nervousness in his posture, the subtle tension in his shoulders betraying the calm mask he tried to maintain. "Monsieur Dupont," Poirot greeted, his voice calm and measured. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Dupont glanced briefly at Hastings before lowering himself into the chair. His gaze shifted back to Poirot, his lips curled into a tight smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I understand the situation here is delicate. I assure you, I am happy to cooperate with your investigation. But I must stress that I had no part in Delacroix's death." Poirot observed him closely, his eyes narrowing. "Slightly, of course, Monsieur Dupont, but we are all interested in the truth. You are aware that Monsieur Delacroix was found dead in his workshop, and you, as a recent acquaintance, seem to have visited him on several occasions. What were you discussing with him?" Dupont hesitated for just a moment, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "I've already told the officers," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "I came to see Delacroix about a piece of work. He had a clock that needed repairing. A rather rare timepiece, you see. He was the only man in the village with the skill to fix it." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And when did you last see him?" "A few days ago," Dupont replied quickly. Quickly I dropped off the piece to be repaired, and we discussed a few business matters. Nothing of any importance." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes locked on Dupont's. "Business matters, you say? This is interesting. You see, Monsieur Dupont, I have learned that Monsieur Delacroix was very secretive about his work, and yet you, a recent acquaintance, were discussing business with him. What business? Exactly. Dupont's jaw tightened, but he quickly regained his composure. It was nothing, really, just a few matters of personal interest. I had no idea that Delacroix was so involved in his own world. He was quite the eccentric, but I never thought he was in danger. Poirot's gaze never left him. You seem nervous, Monsieur Dupont. It is as though you are hiding something. I am not hiding anything, Dupont snapped, his voice rising ever so slightly. I am simply trying to cooperate. I know what you must be thinking, but I swear, to you, I had nothing to do with Delacroix's death. Poirot remained silent for a long moment, allowing the tension to linger. Very well, Monsieur Dupont, but I must tell you, I do not believe in coincidences. You say you came to discuss a piece of business, yet I find it odd that you were the only one who had such business with Delacroix in the days leading up to his death. Did you know, for example, that Monsieur Delacroix was obsessed with the concept of time, that he believed there was something extraordinary hidden within it? Dupont's eyes flickered, the faintest shadow of discomfort passing across his face. Time, that's ridiculous. Delacroix was a clockmaker, yes, but I don't think he had any fantasies about time. It was simply his work, his craft. Poirot's voice softened. And yet, Monsieur Dupont, you seem to have a deeper knowledge of Monsieur Delacroix's mindset than you let on. Tell me, how did you come to know so much about his thoughts on time? More importantly, why did you continue to visit him even after you had no more business with him? Dupont stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. I don't know what you're implying. I've told you everything. Poirot smiled faintly. You see, Monsieur Dupont, every person involved in this case is hiding something. Every one of them has a reason to mislead me. But the truth will come out, sooner or later. You cannot fool me with your lies. Dupont stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. I have nothing more to say. I've told you everything Nope. I am a businessman, not a murderer. If you suspect me, Poirot, you are mistaken. Poirot did not move, his eyes still fixed on the man as he exited the room. We shall see, Monsieur Dupont, Poirot murmured, almost to himself. Hastings, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke. Poirot, do you think Dupont is involved? Poirot leaned back in his chair, his eyes still distant. He has lied to us, Hastings. The nervousness, the hesitation at all points to guilt, but not of the kind he would want us to believe. He may not have killed Delacroix, but he knows more than he is letting on, and in his silence he is complicit in something far more dangerous than murder. Hastings frowned, still unsure. But what about the others? Madame Margot. We trust them, Poirot sighed, his eyes never leaving the door through which Dupont had exited. Hastings, the truth is never simple. Each person involved in this case is holding something back, something important. The pieces of this puzzle are scattered across the lives of these individuals, but we must dig deeper. I believe Dupont has a role to play in all of this, but it is not yet clear what that role is. As the day wore on, Poirot's thoughts remained with Dupont. The businessman was hiding something, but Poirot wasn't yet sure what that was. One thing was certain. The lies were beginning to unravel, and the truth was closer than ever. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. The morning after Dupont's interview, the tension in Rue Voltaire seemed to reach a breaking point. The once serene village, now embroiled in a complicated web of lies, secrets, and death, felt like a pressure cooker. The fog still clung to the streets, a symbol of the confusion surrounding the mystery of Delacroix's death. Poirot, as always, who remained calm, his mind worried with thoughts and suspicions. But even he could feel the weight of the case growing heavier. Hastings, on the other hand, was beginning to feel a deep sense of frustration. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they refused to fall into place. Every person they spoke to seemed to add another layer of complexity to the case, and Hastings was struggling to make sense of it all. Poirot, Hastings said, his voice weary as they sat in the small cafe near Delacroix's workshop. I don't understand. Dupont was lying. There's no doubt about that. But if he wasn't the one who killed Delacroix, why is he hiding the truth? What's his stake in all of this? Poirot looked at him over his cup of coffee, his expression thoughtful. Hastings, the human mind is a curious thing. We are often driven not by the facts themselves, but by what we believe to be true. Dupont, like the others, is hiding something, but not because he killed Delacroix. No, mon ami. Dupont is hiding because he fears what we might discover about him. He is, in fact, terrified. Hastings shook his head. But why would Dupont be afraid of us finding out the truth? What does he have to lose? Poirot took a long sip from his coffee, his eyes narrowing. That Hastings is what we must discover. It is possible that Dupont is involved in something far larger than we can imagine. But for now, we must turn our attention elsewhere. We must question the others. At that moment, the door to the cafe swung open, and a figure stepped inside, causing Poirot to straighten in his seat. It was Madame Margot, the cafe owner, and her appearance was one of obvious distress. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she approached their table. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said in a breathless tone, her voice shaky. I need to speak with you. It's about Monsieur Delacroix. Something has happened, something I can no longer ignore." Poirot looked at her intently, his expression unreadable. "Madame Margot, please sit. What is it that troubles you?" She sank into the chair across from them, her hands folding in front of her. "I've been trying to keep it to myself, but I can no longer stay silent. I've been hiding something that I know now is crucial to this case." Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean, madame? What have you been hiding?" Madame Margot glanced around the cafe nervously, as though expecting someone to overhear. "I've known for some time that Monsieur Delacroix was in trouble," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I didn't want to believe it. He was my friend, after all. He was always so secretive about his work, so wrapped up in his clocks. But in the days leading up to his death, I noticed something strange. He was more agitated than usual, more distracted. He seemed to be looking over his shoulder as though someone was after him." Poirot's eyes never left Madame Margot as she spoke, his mind already working to connect her words with the facts they had gathered. "You say he was agitated, madame. What was it that concerned him?" Madame Margot shook her head, her hands wringing together. "I don't know the details, but I overheard something that haunts me now. He was arguing with a man. I don't know who it was, but I know it wasn't a friendly conversation. Delacroix was shouting about something being stolen, something important. He said it was too dangerous, that it could ruin everything." Poirot smiled faintly. "You see, Monsieur Dupont, every person involved in this case is hiding something. Every one of them has a reason to mislead me. But the truth will come out, sooner or later. You cannot fool me with your lies." Dupont stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "I have nothing more to say. I've told you everything I know. I am a businessman, not a murderer. If you suspect me, Poirot, you are mistaken." Poirot did not move, his eyes still fixed on the man as he exited the room. "We shall see, Monsieur Dupont," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. Hastings, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke. "Poirot, do you think Dupont is involved?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, his eyes still distant. "He has lied to us, Hastings." The nervousness, the hesitation at all points to guilt. "But not of the kind he would want us to believe. He may not have killed Delacroix, but he knows more than he is letting on. And in his silence he is complicit in something far more dangerous than murder." Hastings frowned, still unsure. "But what about the others?" "Madame Margot, we trust them." Poirot sighed, his eyes never leaving the door through which Dupont had exited. "Hastings, the truth is never simple. Each person involved in this case is holding something back, something important. The pieces of this puzzle are scattered across the lives of these individuals. But we must dig deeper. I believe Dupont has a role to play in all of this, but it is not yet clear what that role is." As the day wore on, Poirot's thoughts remained with Dupont. The businessman was hiding something, but Poirot wasn't yet sure what that was. One thing was certain. The lies were beginning to unravel, and the truth was closer than ever. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point the morning after Dupont's interview. The tension in Rue Voltaire seemed to reach a breaking point. The once serene village, now embroiled in a complicated web of lies, secrets, and death, felt like a pressure cooker. The fog still clung to the streets, a symbol of the confusion surrounding the mystery of Delacroix's death. Poirot, as always, remained calm, his mind worried with thoughts and suspicions. But even he could feel the weight of the case growing heavier. Hastings, on the other hand, was beginning to feel a deep sense of frustration. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they refused to fall into place. Every person they spoke to seemed to add another layer of complexity to the case, and Hastings was struggling to make sense of it all. "Poirot," Hastings said, his voice weary as they sat in the small cafe near Delacroix's workshop. "I don't understand. Dupont was lying. There's no doubt about that. But if he wasn't the one who killed Delacroix, why is he hiding the truth? What's his stake in all of this?" Poirot looked at him over his cup of coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Ah, Hastings, the human mind is a curious thing. We are often driven not by the facts themselves, but by what we believe to be true. Dupont, like the others, is hiding something, but not because he killed Delacroix. No, mon ami, Dupont is hiding because he fears what we might discover about him. He is, in fact, terrified." Hastings shook his head. "But why would Dupont be afraid of us finding out the truth? What does he have to lose?" Poirot took a long sip from his coffee, his eyes narrowing. "That, Hastings, is what we must discover. It is possible that Dupont is involved in something far larger than we can imagine. But for now, we must turn our attention elsewhere. We must question the others." At that moment, the door to the cafe swung open, and a figure stepped inside, causing Poirot to straighten in his seat. It was Madame Margot, the cafe owner, and her appearance was one of obvious distress. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she approached their table. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said in a breathless tone, her voice shaky. "I need to speak with you. It's about Monsieur Delacroix. Something has happened, something I can no longer ignore." Poirot looked at her intently, his expression unreadable. "Madame Margot, please. Sit. What is it that troubles you?" She sank into the chair across from them, her hands folding in front of her. I've been trying to keep it to myself, but I can no longer stay silent. I've been hiding something that I know now is crucial to this case. Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean, madame? What have you been hiding? Madame Margot glanced around the cafe nervously, as though expecting someone to overhear. I've known for some time that Monsieur Delacroix was in trouble, she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. But I didn't want to believe it. He was my friend, after all. He was always so secretive about his work, so wrapped up in his clocks. But in the days leading up to his death, I noticed something strange. He was more agitated than usual, more distracted. He seemed to be looking over his shoulder, as though someone was after him. Poirot's eyes never left Madame Margot as she spoke, his mind already working to connect her words with the facts they had gathered. You say he was agitated, madame. What was it that concerned him? Madame Margot shook her head, her hands wringing together. I don't know the details, but I overheard something that haunts me now. He was arguing with a man. I don't know who it was, but I know it wasn't a friendly conversation. Delacroix was shouting about something being stolen, something important. He said it was too dangerous, that it could ruin everything. Hastings looked at Poirot, his brow furrowed. Stolen? What could Delacroix have had that was so important? Poirot's mind raced as he processed Madame Margot's words. A stolen item. Something that could ruin everything. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but there was still so much they didn't know. Madame Margot continued, her voice trembling. I wanted to help him, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. He just kept saying that he had made a terrible mistake, that he'd gone too far. And then, the last time I saw him, he was acting paranoid. He said he had to finish something. That time was running out. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin as he processed this new information. Time, the word echoed in his mind. The same word Delacroix had written on the scrap of paper. Find the last piece. It's in the time. Delacroix had been obsessed with time, not just in his work as a clockmaker, but in some deeper, more dangerous sense. What was this secret he had uncovered, and what had he stolen? Madame Margot, Poirot said softly, his voice filled with quiet intensity. You have given us a very important clue, but there is more, I suspect. You say he was paranoid, and that he spoke of running out of time. This is not the behavior of a man merely concerned with a stolen item. I believe Monsieur Delacroix was involved in something far larger than anyone here has realized. Madame Margot's eyes widened in fear. But what was it, Monsieur Poirot? What could it have been? Poirot's expression darkened as he looked at her. I do not know yet, madame, but I will find out. There is something hidden in this town, something that Delacroix stumbled upon, and it is connected to Timer's obsession, his work, and now, it seems, his death. Hastings leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Poirot, do you think someone killed Delacroix over this secret? Over whatever he was hiding? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, Hastings, I do. Someone was afraid of what Delacroix knew, and that fear led to murder. There was a long silence as Poirot's words hung heavy in the air. The pieces were starting to align, but the full picture was still elusive. The more they uncovered, the more the mystery seemed to deepen. Delacroix had uncovered something tied to his work, something that had cost him his life. Poirot stood up, his gaze sharp and determined. Madame Margot, you have been very helpful. But there is more to this story, I am certain. You must remain available, should I need further information. Madame Margot nodded quickly, a mix of fear and relief on her face. Of course, Monsieur Poirot, I will help in any way I can. As she left the cafe, Poirot turned to Hastings, his expression focused. The truth is close now, Hastings. I can feel it, but there is still much to uncover. We must continue to dig into Delacroix's life, his work, his past. The answers are hidden somewhere, and it is only a matter of time before we find them. Hastings nodded, though he could not shake the feeling that the investigation was hurtling towards something dangerous, something more than just a simple murder. The last piece of the puzzle was still out of reach, but Poirot was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The emotional turning point had arrived, and with it the investigation was about to take a sharp, unexpected turn. Chapter 9. The trap. The investigation had reached a pivotal moment. The pieces were all in motion, and the pressure to uncover the truth was mounting. Poirot could feel that each passing hour added weight to the mystery, the tension thickening around him like a fog. He knew that time was no longer a luxury. The clock was ticking, and each moment brought them closer to the heart of the crime. Poirot and Hastings sat together at the small café in Rue Voltaire, poring over the details of the case once more. The town was quieter than usual, the only sound being the faint ticking of the clocks in the distance, each one marking the passing of time that seemed more precious than ever. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice calm but heavy with thought. We are at the edge of the truth. The last piece is almost within our reach, but there is still something elusive, something we have not yet uncovered. Hastings looked at Poirot, concern etched on his face. But what is it, Poirot? What have we missed? All the clues seem to point to the same place, but we're still no closer to understanding what really happened. Poirot's eyes were sharp, scanning the room as though looking for something hidden in plain sight. Hastings, there are always contradictions in a case. Small lies, inconsistencies in what people say, these are the things that betray the truth. And it is not just the people around Monsieur Delacroix who are involved. No, Hastings. There is something much larger at play here. Something that no one has yet revealed. The cafe door opened, interrupting Poirot's thoughts. It was Inspector Leclerc, his face drawn and weary. He walked over to the table, his usual confidence replaced by a sense of urgency. Monsieur Poirot, Leclerc began, sitting down with him. I've gathered the suspects as you requested. We've kept them, all in separate rooms, waiting for you to begin the questioning. Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing. The time has come, Inspector. We must lay the trap. It is time to apply pressure. The answers will come if we push just the right way. Leclerc looked uneasy but nodded in understanding. You're certain they're involved? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Oh, they are involved, Inspector, but who among them is the murderer? That we will find out soon enough. Poirot stood up, his movements precise and purposeful. He turned to Hastings, who had been silent during the conversation, his mind still working through the possibilities. Hastings, it is time to put our plan into motion, Poirot said, his voice cool but filled with resolve. We shall question each of the suspects again, one by one. But this time we will not merely listen to their words. No, this time we will watch their faces, their gestures. It is in their emotions that we will find the truth. Hastings nodded, his expression now one of firm determination. I'm ready, Poirot. Let's catch this killer. The first to be brought in was Madame Margot. She was the most nervous of all, her face pale and her eyes darting from one corner of the room to the next. She had always been an important figure in the investigation, a woman with secrets she hadn't yet shared. The time had come for her to face the consequences of what she knew. Poirot sat behind the table, his posture erect, his expression calm and controlled. He had already set the stage in his mind. This was not merely an interview, it was a confrontation, and this time he would not let her evade the truth. Madame Margot, Poirot began, his voice gentle but firm. You have been quite helpful in providing information about Monsieur Delacroix, but now we must revisit some of your earlier statements. You spoke of a man with whom Monsieur Delacroix had a disagreement, a man with whom he argued about something being stolen. Margot stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot. There's nothing more. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes piercing. You see, madame, the problem is that you are hiding something. Your actions, your hesitation when speaking of this man, tell me that you know far more than you've let on. The question is, why? Her eyes flickered briefly to the door, and Poirot caught the briefest moment of panic in her expression. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice trembling. Poirot's eyes never left her face. I believe you know exactly what I mean, madame. You see, the truth always comes out. You were afraid of this man, weren't you? The man who was so upset with Delacroix, he was threatening, wasn't he? And you, like the others, were too afraid to speak the full truth. Madame Margot's breath quickened, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, his voice steady and relentless. You see, madame, you were in love with Monsieur Delacroix, weren't you? You were more than just a friend. But Delacroix was a man obsessed with his work, his timepieces, his clocks. He had no room for anything else, not even love. But you, madame, you wanted more. And when you saw him become involved with this man, the man who came to him in secret, you knew it was only a matter of time before you were cast aside. Madame Margot's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot saw her struggle, the tears threatening to surface, the guilt etched deeply in her features. You knew that this secret, whatever it was, could ruin him, Poirot continued, his voice now softer but no less insistent. You knew that this man wanted something more than just a timepiece. He wanted something from Delacroix that no one else could know. Finally, Madame Margot broke, her composure shattered. Yes, I knew, she sobbed, her hands trembling. I knew Delacroix was working on something dangerous. He was being blackmailed by that man. He wouldn't tell me what it was, but I overheard them fighting. Delacroix said he had to finish the work, or it would be too late. He said someone would come for him if he didn't. Poirot remained calm, his gaze never leaving her. Who was this man? Madame, who was Delacroix afraid of? She hesitated, her tears now flowing freely. I don't know his name, but I overheard them talking. The man said he would take everything from Delacroix, his work, his life if he didn't complete it. But I don't know what it was. I don't know what he was working on. Poirot sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Another clue, another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. A blackmailer, a man with a hidden agenda. But there was still more to uncover. Poirot rose from the chair, his face a picture of controlled intensity. Madame Margot, you have been more helpful than you know. You are dismissed for now, but remember this, you cannot escape the truth. We will uncover what was stolen, what was hidden, and when we do, the killer will be revealed. As Madame Margot left the room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Poirot turned to Hastings, his eyes bright with determination. Hastings, I believe we are on the right track. The blackmailer is our key. We must find out who this man is and fast. He's our murderer, and he's still out there. The trap had been set, and now it was only a matter of time before the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The killer was closer than ever, and Poirot was ready to catch him. Chapter 10. The reveal. The morning after Madame Margot's emotional confession, the town of Vauvoltaire seemed quieter than ever. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion that Poirot had been steadily working toward. The last few days had been fraught with revelations, each one building on the last, until the walls of deception began to crack. And now Poirot knew that the time had come to finally expose the truth. Hastings sat across from him in the small, dimly lit room, a faint look of anticipation on his face. The hours of investigation had brought them closer than ever to the heart of the mystery, and Poirot's mind was sharper than ever as he prepared to make the final move. "Mon ami," Poirot began, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that matched the gravity of the moment. "We are at the point of revelation. All the pieces of the puzzle have fallen into place, and I believe we now know who is responsible for Monsieur Delacour's death." Hastings, though eager to hear Poirot's thoughts, couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. "Poirot, it's been days of questioning, of lies and half-truths, but it feels like there's still something missing. Who killed Delacroix?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes, always keen, seemed to flicker with the excitement of the chase, the thrill of nearing the end of the investigation. "You are right, Hastings," Poirot said with a slight smile. "Something was missing, but now I see it clearly. The final piece of the puzzle, the answer we've been searching for, was always right in front of us." Poirot's eyes locked with Hastings as he spoke, the gravity of his words sinking in. Monsieur Delacroix was not simply a clockmaker. He was an inventor, a man who sought to understand not just time, but the very nature of it. His obsession with clocks, with mechanisms, went far beyond the craft of making timepieces. He had stumbled upon something of great importance. But it was more than just a secret, it was dangerous. Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. What exactly did he discover, Poirot? What could have been worth killing for? Poirot nodded slowly, his expression becoming more serious. Monsieur Delacroix had been working on a device, a timepiece, yes, but one that could manipulate time itself. A clock, if you will, that could not only measure time, but alter it, at least in the context of perception. He had created a machine, capable of changing the way people perceived time, and it is this very invention that led to his death. Hastings stared at him, dumbfounded. Alter time? That sounds impossible. How could anyone, let alone a clockmaker, create something like that? Poirot gave a faint smile, clearly amused by Hastings' disbelief. "Ah, mon ami, you forget that Monsieur Delacroix was no ordinary man. He was a genius, a visionary. His obsession with time led him to study not just clocks, but the very essence of time itself. He was working on something that could, theoretically, manipulate how time was experienced by the individual." Hastings shook his head in confusion. But why would anyone kill him over it? What was so dangerous about this invention? Poirot's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "That is where the danger lies, Hastings. This device, this invention of Delacroix's, had the potential to change the balance of power. It could make time quite literally bend to the will of its possessor, and that, my friend, is a power that many would kill to control." Hastings was silent for a moment, struggling to wrap his mind around Poirot's explanation. "So, someone wanted to steal this invention. Someone wanted to control it." Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming with the certainty that only he could possess. "Exactly, and now we know who." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Inspector Leclerc stepped inside, his face grim. "Monsieur Poirot, we've brought in all the suspects, just as you asked. They're all waiting in the other room." Poirot stood up, his posture tall and commanding. "Thank you, Inspector. We are ready." The suspects were brought in one by one. First, Etienne Laurent, the jeweler, who had known Delacroix for years and seemed to have some connection to the clockmaker's work. Then Madame Margot, whose emotional breakdown had revealed her deeper involvement in the case than she had initially let on. And finally, Gerard Dupont, the businessman, whose lies had painted him as a man trying to hide his true motivations. As each person entered the room, Poirot carefully studied their reactions, watching their every movement. The tension in the room was palpable as the group of suspects gathered around the table. Poirot's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have spent days investigating the death of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix, and I now know the truth. The person responsible for his murder is not who you might expect. The key to solving this case lies not in who killed Monsieur Delacroix, but in what he had discovered, what he had created." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Poirot continued, his eyes locking onto each of the suspects in turn. Monsieur Delacroix was not just a clockmaker. He was an inventor, and he had discovered something that could change everything, a device that could alter the perception of time itself. And it was this invention that led to his death. He turned to Etienne Laurent, his gaze unwavering. Monsieur Laurent, you were close to Delacroix, but you did not kill him. You were too consumed with your own greed, your obsession with rare timepieces, to see the real value of what Delacroix had created. You thought you could acquire his work for your own gain, but you lacked the vision to understand it fully. Laurent's eyes flickered nervously, but he remained silent. Poirot then turned to Madame Margot. Madame, you were in love with Monsieur Delacroix, but you were not the one who killed him. Your love blinded you to the truth, and in your desperation to protect him, you kept his secrets. But your heart, though loyal, was not enough to keep you from seeing the danger he was in. Madame Margot's eyes were filled with tears, her hand trembling as she clasped it to her chest. Poirot's eyes then fell upon Gerard Dupont, who had been unusually calm throughout the proceedings. And you, Monsieur Dupont, Poirot said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. You are the one who killed Monsieur Delacroix. You came to him, a businessman driven by greed and power, wanting to control the invention he had created. You saw in Delacroix's device the key to unimaginable power you believed would make you invincible. Dupont's face tightened, his hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. Poirot's voice was now firm, resolute. You killed Delacroix because he refused to give you what you wanted. He was the only one who knew how to complete the device, how to unlock its full potential. And you, Monsieur Dupont, knew that if you didn't act quickly, Delacroix would take that secret to the grave. Dupont's face twisted in anger, but he remained silent, the guilt written all over his features. Poirot smiled, satisfied with the clarity of the moment. The truth, as always, was hiding in plain sight. Monsieur Dupont, your greed and ambition led you to murder, but in the end, it was your own fear of losing control that sealed your fate. Dupont's expression faltered, and for the first time, he looked truly defeated. You're right, he whispered. I killed him. I had no choice. I needed that invention. Poirot nodded, his gaze unyielding. You did have a choice, Monsieur Dupont, but now, justice will be served. As Dupont was led away in handcuffs, the room remained silent, each person reflecting on the revelations that had just unfolded. Poirot stood by the table, his expression calm, but there was a sense of finality in the air. The mystery of Lucien Delacroix's death had been solved. The trap had been set, and the killer had walked right into it. Chapter 11. The reflection. The investigation was over. The fog that had enveloped Rue Voltaire seemed to lift as quickly as it had come, leaving the village basking in the golden light of a late afternoon. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter, as though the weight of the mystery had finally been lifted. And yet, despite the satisfaction of a case solved, Poirot found himself deep in thought, his mind still processing the final moments of the investigation. Hastings, who sat in reflective silence as they walked together back to the café where they had first discussed the case so many days ago. The streets of Rue Voltaire, which had felt so filled with suspicion and tension, now seemed almost peaceful in the aftermath of the truth. The quiet ticking of the clocks, once an eerie reminder of the passing of time, now seemed like a gentle hum, a reminder of the world continuing on as it always had. Poirot, Hastings said finally, breaking the silence. I still can't quite believe it. Dupont was the killer all along. He seemed so calm, so collected. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes distant as though reflecting on the nature of the case itself. Ah, mon ami, that is the way of it. Often the ones who appear calmest are the ones with the most to hide. Monsieur Dupont was driven by a fear of losing control. His ambition clouded his judgment. He wanted power, Hastings, but he was blinded by his own desire. Hastings furrowed his brow, trying to piece everything together. But the device, the one Delacroix created, it was supposed to alter the perception of time itself. How could anyone believe that such a thing was possible? Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with the hint of amusement that was characteristic of him. You see, Hastings, that is the beauty of this case. The truth was not in the device itself, but in the belief that it could change everything. Monsieur Delacroix did not intend to create a device that could literally manipulate time, but he understood the concept of perception. It was this perception of time that Monsieur Dupont sought to control, to harness for his own gain. Hastings shook his head, still struggling to understand. So Dupont thought he could control time. Not time itself, Poirot corrected, his voice steady, but the way people experienced it. Monsieur Dupont believed that if he could control Delacroix's invention, he would have the power to manipulate how people perceived the passage of time. They valued it, how they feared it, how they used it. Time is the most valuable resource, Hastings, and he thought he could possess it, hold it in his hands. Hastings let out a long breath. But how could Delacroix not see it coming? If Dupont was so intent on getting the invention, why didn't Delacroix destroy it, or at least hide it? Poirot's face grew serious, his gaze fixed ahead. Ah, that is the tragedy of it all. Monsieur Delacroix was so absorbed in his work, so focused on the possibility of understanding time, that he did not see the danger in sharing it with others. He was a man of great intellect, Hastings, but his mind was clouded by his obsession with his own creation. He believed no one could understand its true potential as he did, and that belief blinded him to the threat to Dupont. posed. Hastings remained quiet for a moment, contemplating Poirot's words and Madame Margot. What was her role in all of this? Poirot's expression softened, his tone reflective. Madame Margot was not involved in the murder, mon ami, but she, too, was a victim. She loved Delacroix, yes, but she was not aware of the danger he was in. She tried to protect him, to keep him from harm, but she did not understand the full scope of his secret. In the end, she became entangled in the web of lies and deception that surrounded him. She believed that her love for him could shield him from the world, but, as often happens, it was not enough. Hastings nodded slowly, his face thoughtful and Laurent. What about him? Was he just another part of Dupont's plan? Poirot gave a small shake of his head. No, Hastings. Laurent was not involved in the murder. He was a man of simple desires. His obsession was with rare timepieces, not with the manipulation of time itself. He had no idea what Delacroix was working on, nor did he understand the implications of it. He was, as you say, a red herring. But even the red herrings play their part in a mystery. They arrived at the café, where Poirot paused for a moment before entering. It is always the same, he said softly. The world is full of secrets, of people who hide their true intentions behind masks of civility. The mystery is not just with the crime, Hastings, but in the people who commit them. The human mind is the greatest puzzle of all. As they sat at their usual table, Poirot's gaze turned to the window, his eyes lost in thought. You see, Hastings, the truth of this case was not just about solving the murder of Monsieur Delacroix. It was about understanding why Dupont acted as he did. The murder was not simply about greed, but about control. Dupont wanted power not through wealth or status, but through time itself. Hastings looked at Poirot, his admiration for his friend growing deeper with each passing word. So, in the end, Dupont's obsession with time destroyed him, just as it destroyed Delacroix. Poirot smiled faintly, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Exactly, Hastings. In the end, time remains the one thing that no man can control. It slips through our fingers no matter how hard we try to hold on to it. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the café around them. Poirot's thoughts were already turning to the next case, the next mystery that awaited him. But for now, there was a moment of peace, a moment of reflection on the complexity of the human mind and the way it twisted and turned through the labyrinth of life. You know, Hastings said after a long silence, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to fully understand how your mind works. Poirot's smile widened, but his eyes remained focused. Ah, Hastings, that is the joy of it, is it not? To never truly understand, to always have one more puzzle to solve. But in the end, that is what makes life interesting. No, Hastings laughed, softly, leaning back in his chair. I suppose you're right. But I'll never stop trying to keep up with you. Poirot chuckled. That is all I ask, my friend, and with that, we shall continue, one mystery at a time. And so, the case of the clockmaker of Rue Voltaire came to an end. But as always, the mysteries of the world remained, waiting for the next time Hercule Poirot's little grey cells would be called into action.